Chapter 6, Learning. It is estimated that over 30,000 service dogs are active in the United States. Service dogs are even trained to assist individuals who have diabetes and may not always know when their blood sugar is too low. 3 individual cases of service dogs saving their owners' lives are discussed in the book. How are these dogs trained? And how are their amazing skills acquired? Using the basic principles of learning, service dogs learn to assist people in a variety of ways, which are often life-saving and heroic. In this chapter, you will learn about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational learning, factors that affect learning, and health and wellness in relation to learning. So learning is a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. Behaviorism is a theory of learning that focuses on observable behavior. It does not include mental activities such as thinking, wishing, and hoping. Associative learning occurs when an association is made between 2 events. Conditioning occurs when you have learned about that association. There are 2 types of conditioning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. A second type of learning is known as observational learning, which occurs when an individual observes and then imitates another individual's behavior. Operant conditioning, or instrumental conditioning, is a form of associative learning where the consequences of behavior change the probability of the behavior's occurrence. Operant conditioning helps to explain voluntary type behavior. Classical conditioning helps to explain involuntary behavior. It occurs when a neutral stimulus is associated with a meaningful stimulus and then acquires a similar response. Most students will learn about Pavlov's dogs when studying classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was a pioneer in classical conditioning. He conducted research looking at digestion in the body. He discovered that dogs would salivate to more than just meat powder that he was using to solicit drooling. He found that they would salivate to the side of the food dish, the individual who brought in the meat powder, and the sound of the door closing when the meat powder arrived. The dog's behavior included both learned and unlearned components. The unlearned components are known as reflexes. In this example, food is an unconditioned stimulus. It brings about a response without any prior learning. In dogs, it will bring about drooling, which is an unconditioned response. It's an unlearned response in response to food as the stimulus. A neutral stimulus refers to a stimulus that has no value at all. This stimulus would not naturally elicit the unconditioned response. The conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus that, when associated with a conditioned stimulus, elicits a conditioned response. Acquisition is the learning of the association between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, ending with the conditioned response. The timing interval between the presentation of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus determines the contiguity in time. Conditioned responses are learned best when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus occur close together in time. Not only must there be contiguity, but there also must be contingency, which is the predictability of the occurrence of one stimulus from the presence of another stimulus. The conditioned stimulus should provide a signal that the unconditioned stimulus is on its way. Once the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus has been formed, the meaning of the conditioned stimulus changes. This once arbitrary object now has meaning or is motivational. So here you can see a diagram walking through Pavlov's experiment. Food as an unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned or automatic response from the dog. Here, a neutral stimulus does not elicit a response. But when you pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually this stimulus by itself will elicit the same conditioned response. John Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner demonstrated the use of classical conditioning in the development of fear in an experiment involving a little infant named Albert. They brought a white rat into the room, and Albert was not afraid of the rat. He played with it. Later, when Albert played with the white rat, Watson made a loud noise behind his head, and it made him cry. After pairing the loud noise with the rat several times, Albert would start crying at just the sight of the rat. He associated the rat with the previous loud noise that had occurred when he had been playing with it. If fear can be established through classical conditioning, do you think that the same can be done in the opposite, in terms of getting rid of fear? Little Albert also went on to associate the loud noise not only with the white rat, but with other white objects, as well as furry things in general. As you can see in the picture, the rabbit's not white, but he is crying. So looking at how we can apply this to our lives today, it is not unusual today to see the marketing ploys that use attractive people in marketing to associate them with their products they are trying to sell in commercial ads. Many advertisers use classical conditioning by associating something naturally good, which is the unconditioned stimulus, with something neutral, which is the conditioned stimulus, such as the advertisement of E-Trade Baby. When these stimuli occur together, the neutral stimulus brings on the same response as the naturally occurring response. Advertisers use classical conditioning when it comes to a product placement within a show or a movie, a process known as embedded marketing. Through classical conditioning, the sight of or act of taking a pill with medicine soon comes to elicit the same pain relief as the medicine itself. Research on the immune system and the endocrine system provides the strongest evidence for the role of classical conditioning on placebo effects. Placebo effect is when you believe you're taking a medication, but in actuality it is a sugar pill or something of no value, but yet it elicits the same response. Even the human body's internal organ system can be classically conditioned. Research has found evidence that suggests classical conditioning can produce immunosuppression, a decrease in the production of antibodies which can lower a person's ability to fight disease. Stress also has an important role in the learned associations between conditioned stimuli and immune and endocrine functioning. When drugs are taken at a certain time of day in a certain place, the body will react in anticipation of the upcoming drug ingestion. Habituation refers to the decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated presentations. It also brings up the topic of tolerance, increased tolerance, where you also have to have more of the drug to get the same response. This aspect of drug use has been found to play a role in death caused by drug overdose. The drug user actually takes the drug in a certain place, like their bedroom. A conditioned response is acquired in this location. Because of the classical conditioning, as soon as it enters the bedroom, the person's body begins to prepare for the upcoming drug ingestion in order to lessen the effects of the insult of the drug. But let's say the drug user is at a friend's house and they go into the friend's bedroom to take the drug. The effect of the drug is greater because there was no CR built up from the friend's bedroom, and therefore the body's not prepared for the drug ingestion. Unlike conventional classical conditioning, taste aversion can occur under very impoverished learning conditions. In particular, powerful taste aversion can be learned with just one exposure rather than dozens, where the UCR does not occur for several hours instead of within a split second. This is considered a counterexample to Pavlov's theory and shows that not all stimulus-response associations stand on equal footing. Some are biologically primed, or as we shall see toward the end of the presentation, biologically prepared. A special type of classical conditioning is involved with taste aversion, by which an individual learns to associate between a particular taste and nausea. It's a special case because it only requires one pairing of the neutral stimulus with the conditioned response. Think of the last time maybe you had food poisoning. It didn't take you getting food poisoning multiple times to have an aversion to the food that got you sick. To combat this special type of learning, researchers have designed specific medications with flavorful, more appealing taste to reduce the often negative responses to drugs. This way, the patient more likely to develop taste aversion to the flavor and not to the medication itself. Some researchers suggest that taste aversion is a demonstration of how learning through classical conditioning happens in the natural world, where associations matter in order to survive. Generalization occurs when a new stimulus that is similar to the original stimulus elicits a response that is similar to the conditioned response. So for instance, if you have an aversion to coffee, then the candy toffee, which tastes similar to coffee, may elicit the same response. Discrimination is learning to respond to certain stimuli while not responding to others. So being able to differentiate between different stimuli. So maybe being able to differentiate between the actual coffee drink versus toffee candy. When the unconditioned stimulus is taken away and no longer associated with the conditioned stimulus, then extinction occurs. It is the weakening of the conditioned response in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. Spontaneous recovery occurs when the conditioned response returns after a time delay without any further condition occurring. Renewal to the recovery of the conditioned response can occur when the organism is placed in a novel context. Looking at food, even in the absence of hunger, sometimes hunger does elicit the unconditioned response of eating. However, many of us have learned to associate food cues with hunger and therefore eat. So advertisement, maybe the feeling that food can bring upon, the increase in energy of sugar, whatever those food cues are, then we associate them with hunger and therefore eat, even though we're really not hungry. This diagram illustrates how school itself can become aversive when associated with bully, but pleasant when associated with kindly friends. Thus, to counteract the association with bullies, keep the bullies away, which would be extinction, and replace them with kindly friends, producing an incompatible response. Therapists use counter-conditioning to change the relationship between a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. The process occurs when the conditioned response is weakened because the stimulus is associated with a new response that is not compatible with the unwanted behavior. Aversive conditioning is a form of treatment that consists of repeated pairings of a stimulus with a very unpleasant stimulus. To reduce drinking, every time a person drinks an alcoholic beverage, he or she also consumes a mixture that induces nausea. Eventually, through repeated pairing, the alcohol becomes the conditioned stimulus that elicits nausea. This drug is antabuse. It's been used for drug treatment for alcoholism since the 1940s and continues to be used in treatment of alcoholism today. Now switching to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning is a form of associative learning where the consequences of behavior change the probability of the behavior's occurrence. Classical conditioning was useful in explaining involuntary behavior, whereas operant conditioning helps to explain voluntary behavior. Just as in classical conditioning, contingency is an important aspect in operant conditioning as well. E.L. Thorndike's experiments established the power of consequences in determining voluntary behavior. In his historical experiment, he placed a hungry cat inside a box. The cat would exit the box and receive food if he could figure out how to escape. After many attempts, the cat accidentally stepped on the lever which opened the door and was able to escape. With subsequent trials, the cat decreased the number of ineffective movements and increased its time of escape. The law of effects established by Thorndike states that those behaviors followed by positive outcomes will be strengthened, and those behaviors followed by negative outcomes will be weakened. B.F. Skinner's contribution was that he standardized the language that scientists used to refer to learning. After all, Skinner's undergraduate studies were not in psychology but in English literature. Skinner worked with the U.S. military to train pigeons to guide missiles and torpedoes. Skinner believed that the basic principle of operant conditioning could be applied to all species. When he trained pigeons to guide missiles, he placed the pigeons in the warhead of a missile, and the pigeon would peck at the moving image on the screen. The pigeon received food when it kept the designated target to the center of the screen. The U.S. military never used Skinner's pigeon-guided missile concept. However, it did work. In the 1930s, Skinner created an operant conditioning chamber known as a Skinner box to study the principles of operant conditioning. Think about positive and negative reinforcement. What would it be an example of each? Keep that in mind. One other thing to note is that shaping refers to the rewarding of successive approximations of a desired behavior. Each step toward the desired behavior is rewarded until the desired behavior occurs. So think about trying to get a dog to ride a skateboard. You would give him rewards for 1, even being close to the skateboard. Then 2, maybe putting front paws on the skateboard, then all paws on the skateboard, and then staying on the skateboard as it moves. Anytime you put a back foot down to give him be able to push, give him a treat. See, keep giving treats as that behavior moves forward until it was what you wanted. Reinforcement occurs when a stimulus or event following a particular behavior increases the probability of that behavior again. Now, it can be positive or it can be negative. Positive reinforcement occurs when something desirable is presented to increase the likelihood of the behavior to occur again. Negative reinforcement occurs when something bad is taken away, and it increases the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. So both positive and negative reinforcement refer to increasing behavior. Positive and negative reinforcement are not references to good or bad, but indicate the process by which something is either given, which is a positive, or removed as a negative, that reinforces behavior. So here you can see the behavior is turning homework in on time. Positive reinforcement would be that you receive praise from the teacher. Negative reinforcement would be that the teacher stops criticizing your nagging. If you wax your skis, a positive reinforcement would be that you go faster. A negative reinforcer would be that people stop zooming by you on the slope. Behavior here, if you press an odd button on a dashboard of a friend's car, positive reinforcer would be great music playing. Negative reinforcer would be that annoying music stops playing. A special kind of response to negative reinforcement is called avoidance learning. In this case, the organism learns that by making a particular response, a negative stimulus can be altogether avoided. The behavior is maintained even in the absence of any aversive stimuli. The consequences in avoidant reinforcement is indirect. It amounts to consequence prevention, which is far different from negative reinforcement. The latter is stimulus removal, an actual consequence. So here, the behavior, all kinds of attempts, failure to reinforce, nothing works. In some cases, people may experience unavoidable negative stimuli. And this can lead to learned helplessness, which means that the organism has learned that it has no control over negative outcomes. And what happens is they may learn just not to try at all, because everything that they have tried, they did not receive any type of reinforcer. So looking at types of reinforcers. Primary reinforcement involves reinforcers that are biological in need, meaning they are needed for survival. Some primary reinforcers are food, water, sex, etc. Secondary reinforcers gain their positive value through experience. They are usually used to gain access to primary reinforcers. Money is a good example of a secondary reinforcer, as it is used to obtain primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers can be linked to primary reinforcers through classical conditioning. Consider pairing the sound of a whistle and food to the reward of a desirable behavior for an animal to perform, such as a trick. Secondary reinforcers are used in a token economy to influence behavior. Generalization occurs when a reinforced behavior is performed in a different situation. Discrimination occurs when an individual responds to stimuli that signal when a behavior will or will not be reinforced. Extinction occurs when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced, and therefore the individual is less likely to perform the behavior. Continuous reinforcement occurs when the behavior is reinforced every time it occurs. And partial reinforcement occurs when the behavior gets reinforced only some of the time. It can be fixed, variable, ratio, or interval. Fixed ratio schedules reinforce behavior after a set number of behaviors. For example, a child may receive a piece of candy after practicing the piano for 5 days instead of every time they play. A variable ratio schedule occurs when a behavior is reinforced after an average of times, but the average is unpredictable. A good example of a variable ratio schedule is slot machines. The payout on the slot machine is set, but the player doesn't know when that is. Fixed interval schedule rewards the first desired behavior after a specific amount of time has passed. An example of a fixed interval schedule is election time. Politicians beef up their campaigns around election time, and then after they are elected, they become more relaxed until the election time rolls around again. A variable interval schedule occurs when the desired behavior is rewarded after a varying amount of time has passed. Pop quizzes are a good example of variable interval schedules because the students do not know when they will occur, but they do know there will be a quiz at some point in time. So here you can see on schedules of reinforcement, on the left-hand side, the cumulative response as it increases, and on this axis as time increases. So you can see here that fixed ratio increases the response quicker, and then here is your variable ratio. Your fixed interval takes a little more time, as well as the variable interval, and they do not increase as much as the fixed and variable ratios. So the goal of punishment is usually to decrease behavior. It's a consequent that decreases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. In the case of punishment, behavior is usually weakened due to the presentation of something unpleasant, or it can be the removal of something pleasant. Positive punishment occurs when something bad is given to decrease the likelihood of behavior occurring again. Negative punishment occurs when something good is taken away to decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. Timeout is a form of negative punishment in this situation. The child is removed from a positive reinforcer such as their toys or friends. So here we're looking at the behavior take aspirin for a headache. A positive punishment would be having an allergic reaction, whereas a negative punishment would be lose sympathetic attention of your spouse. A negative reinforcer would be that the headache goes away. Remember, a reinforcer increases behavior. So if your headache goes away, you're more likely to take that aspirin again. Looking at the behavior of showing off by speeding, a positive punishment would be getting pulled over and given a ticket because they're giving you something. A negative punishment would be that you're going to lose $250 to pay that ticket. Now, a negative reinforcer, remember reinforcers increase the behavior, would be if you lost a gangster who was tailing you. So timing of reinforcement and punishment is important. In operant conditioning, the shorter the time span between the behavior and the reinforcer, the better. It works best if it is a few seconds. This is especially true in lower intelligent animals. Humans, however, have the ability to learn from delayed reinforcers. Sometimes in life, the decision comes down to whether to receive a small immediate reinforcer or wait for a larger reinforcer. Also, immediate punishment is more effective than delayed punishment. Again, this principle is more valid with lower animals than humans. Sometimes the potential delayed consequences are negative, but the immediate consequences are difficult to override, such in the case with eating and obesity. Individuals knowing that eating too much and gaining weight is a health risk, but the immediate satisfaction of eating is often too great to stop the overeating. This pattern also applies to smoking and drinking alcohol. When the delayed consequences are punishers, the immediate consequences are reinforcers, and the immediate ones usually win. Looking at applied behavioral analysis, this is also called behavioral modification. It uses operant conditioning techniques to change human behavior by analyzing and manipulating behaviors through the enhanced use of rewards and punishers. If we can figure out what rewards and punishers are controlling a person's behavior, we can change them and impact the behavior itself. Applied behavioral analysis has a wide range of uses: training autistic individuals, children and adolescents with psychological problems, instruction of effective parenting, and to enhance environmentally conscious behaviors. Observational learning is also called imitation or modeling, and it occurs when a person observes and imitates behavior. It takes less time than operant conditioning. In the Bobo doll study, Albert Bandura demonstrated that children who watched an aggressive model were more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. He described 4 main processes that are involved in observational learning, including attention, retention, motor reproduction, and reinforcement. Attention occurs when a person attends to what another individual is doing or saying. Retention occurs when the individual must encode the information and keep it in memory so that it can be retrieved. Motor reproduction occurs when the individual imitates what the other individual is doing, and reinforcement occurs when the observer sees the model attain a reward for the behavior. This is vicarious reinforcement. However, if the observer witnesses the model being punished, then the behavior is less likely to be imitated. This is vicarious punishment. Observational learning has been studied in a variety of contexts, from examining how gorillas learn from one another to how individuals use it to make economic decisions. Researchers are interested in comparing the factors involved in learning from experience with learning through observation. Both Skinner's approach to operant conditioning and Pavlov's approach to classical conditioning do not take into account how memory, thinking, planning, and expectations might be important to learning. So do cognitions matter? Does learning involve more than the environment-behavior connections? What about purposive behavior in humans? We have goals, we set them, and then we regulate and monitor ourselves. Purposive behavior is the idea that much of behavior is goal-directed. E.C. Tolman believed that the whole behavioral sequence must be studied in order to understand why a person engages in a behavior. This theory helps to understand how people self-regulate and self-monitor their behavior to reach a goal. Expectancy learning was created by Tolman, who believed that when classical conditioning and operant conditioning occur, the organism acquires certain expectations. In terms of classical conditioning, he believed or emphasized that the information value of the conditioned stimulus is important as a signal or expectation that the unconditioned stimulus will follow. Research by Leon Kamin emphasized the information value of the conditioned stimulus in a classical conditioning experiment with rats. Latent learning or implicit learning is a type of unreinforced learning that is not immediately reflected in behavior. A classic study of using hungry rats in a maze demonstrated that what an organism learns may not be noticeable right away, but at a later time, that original learning is viewed. Insight learning is a form of problem solving in which the organism develops a sudden insight into or understanding of a problem solution. It is essentially different from learning through trial and error or through conditioning. The floating peanut problem is an example of insightful learning demonstrated by non-human primates. Insight learning happens all of a sudden, as though things just pop into an individual's head. Multicultural experiences and exposure have been documented to show benefit in higher education. Consider the increasingly diverse campuses and student bodies. Many universities recognize the need for students to be more culturally diverse as they plan to enter the workforce. Some other considerations. Biological constraints. The structure of an organism's body permits certain kinds of behavior and inhibits others. There's an instinctive drift that refers to the tendency of animals to revert back to its instinctive behavior that then interferes with learning. Preparedness is an organism's biological predisposition to learn in certain ways, but not others. Also, taste aversions occur when an organism eats something and gets ill. Most of the time, it was not the food that made the organism ill, but just the same, the organism develops a distaste for that food that was eaten prior to getting ill. Preparedness can also be demonstrated from research on conditioning humans and monkeys to associate snakes with fear. Cultural influences also are a factor. Culture can influence the degree to which classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning are used. Culture can also demonstrate the content of learning. Organisms cannot learn about something they do not experience. Psychological constraints exist as well. Mindset is described as the way a person believes about their ability to dictate what goals are set for them, what they think they can learn, and what they actually learn. Individuals can have either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. Incremental theory says that intelligence is something that a person increases and improves upon. Effective strategies for developing a growth mindset can be understanding that your intelligence and thinking skills are not fixed but can be changed, to become passionate about learning and challenging your mind, and to think about the mindset of people you admire, as well as starting. Just commit to it. A lot of people have learned about learning styles, whether you're a visual, oral, kinesthetic type learner, but research has shown that there's no evidence that tailoring teaching methods to particular learning styles improves learning. People do have their preferred learning styles, however. So looking at stress. When something stressful is going to happen, it is less stressful if it's predicted to occur beforehand. Having a sense of control can help in avoiding feelings of stress over difficulties. It can be especially stressful when an individual feels a lack of control over aversive stimuli. Learned helplessness occurs when an individual learns that outcomes are not controllable, and therefore they stop trying to gain control at all. The perception of improvement, even when one situation is worse than another, is related to lower stress. Having an outlet for life's frustrations helps also in decreasing stress. So in this chapter, you should be able to describe learning, explain classical conditioning, explain operant conditioning, understand observational learning, describe the role of cognition in learning, identify biological, cultural, and psychological factors in learning, and describe how principles of learning apply to health and wellness.